Welcome back to another episode of the VIA podcast dedicated to exploring the American West. And this is not just any episode of the VIA podcast, it is the final episode of this season. I'm Michelle Donati, and this is my co-host,
Mitty Hicks.
Oh, Mitty, we have been all over the West this season.
My heart is so full. I just love how these episodes, from foraging to exploring natural wonders and visiting state parks versus national parks, just have me thinking about traveling in a different way.
There's only one way we can end this season. We have to go to ghost towns. We have to go where the authentic West was born and maybe even meet some of the ghosts that remain in the West.
You're smiling way too hard for me.
Mitty, have you ever visited a ghost town?
I don't go to ghost towns or haunted houses. Have you been to ghost towns?
My parents took me to Tombstone. I've been to the Superstition Mountains, both in Arizona.
You're too happy for me. I don't like where this is going at all. At all.
Mitty, there's still some remnants of ghost towns, and I just think we need to go explore and see what cast of characters is still out there. And I feel like this episode is going to change your mind. If we can talk to one expert who can change your mind on a ghost town, it's going to be our guest today.
You are betting a lot there, I see.
He's going to make you a believer. Brent Underwood spent his life savings to purchase his very own ghost town, Cerro Gordo, an original boomtown silver mine in southeastern California. What followed were fires, floods, earthquakes, and surprisingly, fame. YouTube videos tracking his efforts to bring the town back to life have garnered millions of views.
He's also the author of the New York Times bestseller, Ghost Town Living, Mining for Purpose and Chasing Dreams at the Edge of Death Valley. Brent lives in Cerro Gordo with no running water, 7 cats, 6 goats, and maybe 1 ghost. Brent Underwood, welcome to the VIA podcast.
All right. Thank you for having me.
So lots of questions right off the bat, especially 7 cats, 6 goats, 1 ghost. Can you tell us who this 1 ghost is that you might be living with? What's the story there?
Yeah, ghost towns have an interesting history. They can call ghost towns because they're abandoned, and they can be called ghost towns because there's paranormal activity in them. I'm not a huge on the believer side of it. I would say I have had experiences here that I can't quite explain. You know, I have my one kind of go-to experience where this is early on in my stay here, and I had just come up to the property. At the time, we had a caretaker living here. And there's a building called the bunkhouse here. And that's usually where if we had contractors or people staying in the town, they would kind of stay there while they were working on the place. And I remember walking past the bunkhouse one night and somebody looked out the window. They looked at me. The light was on in the kitchen. I didn't think much of it. But then in the morning, our caretaker, Robert, came. I was going, and I said, "Oh, how long are the contractors staying in the bunkhouse?" And he kind of looked at me pretty grim and he said, they haven't been up here in 3 weeks. And so that's an interesting thing because
Stop it.
I'm pretty rational. And like I said, I started this conversation that I'm not a big believer in the paranormal, but I saw somebody in the window, and Cerro Gordo isn't a place that you just come upon. We're at the end of an 8-mile dirt road in the middle of nowhere. And so immediately I was like, well, I have to go investigate this. So I went down to the bunkhouse, looked through all the rooms. Nobody's in there. The light was still on. I turned off the light in the kitchen, put a padlock on the door, and then what happened next is kind of what freaked me out a little bit because I went about my day, didn't think anything of it. That night, I went to go watch the sunset again, and the light in the kitchen was back on.
Oh my goodness.
I know that I turned it off. I know that I put a padlock on. I know that I was the only one with the key. And so my way of handling it these days is just to avoid the bunkhouse completely. I figured, there's plenty of space up here. We have almost 400 acres. They can hang out there. I'll hang out everywhere else. And since then, no real incidents. Lots of visitors over time have had their own stories about different people that they've seen, but I kind of steer clear of the bunkhouse these days.
The fact that you still live there after that experience, it just shows that we are 2 different people, because I would have I'm out.
I didn't have much of a choice. This was pretty early pandemic days when I first originally kind of settled in here. And so you figure this is my place to socially distance. This is where I was going to get away from it all. And so I figured I would just learn to deal with it. And luckily since then, I'll knock on wood, but no huge incidents since.
What did the person look like?
Yeah, it was interesting. It was a woman. I don't remember the specifics of it, just, the longer hair, like I believe like a dress of some type. And the bunkhouse, to paint the picture a little bit more clearly, like imagine a building built in the 1910s that has sheet metal as siding, and then there's lace curtains in every window. And so the thing that was moving was like the lace curtain was pulled out. Somebody looked out, the lace curtain was kind of put back in place. And so that was the eeriness of it that I can still feel when I talk about it.
Michelle, I have chills. I don't know about you. Like the hair on the back of my neck is standing up, and it's daytime, and just all the feels right now.
I do feel like she deserves a name. So have you named this ghost?
Well, so there's a few famous ghosts at Cerro Gordo that maybe aren't famous to me, but were famous from previous people here. There's one that people call the woman in the black dress. So apparently over the last 50 years, there's a recurring person that people see in the streets of this woman in the black dress. And if we're trying to figure out who that may be in the history of Cerro Gordo, there was a woman that lived up here named Lola Travis. And Lola was a very prominent entrepreneur in their day. She owned all of the brothels in town and all the surrounding towns.
Oh.
And she was pretty infamous for being somebody not to mess with. You know, there's a story that came out of Darwin, a neighboring mining town, where there was a disagreement about a bill. And I believe that Lola shot the man dead in the street. So one theory is that the woman in the black dress could be Lola Travis, somebody who has spent a lot of time up here, probably in some pretty precarious situations. But beyond that, I'm not sure.
So how the heck did you come up with, I want to buy a ghost town?
Yeah, I grew up in Florida, and my grandfather lived with us for the final years of his life. He had dementia, and his favorite thing to do was to watch Gunsmoke, the old Western TV show, just on repeat over and over and over and over. And so I've thought about this question a lot, and I think that if there's a seed that was planted early, it was this Western idea that, you know, out West, there's always adventures to be had, things to discover, just this life of excitement. And I think that just generally the American West holds a certain romanticism within the American culture. I always had this fascination with buildings, with the Old West. That led me to be in Austin, Texas, where I had a bed and breakfast that was housed in a Victorian mansion from the 1870s. I enjoyed my time there, but I just felt like I kind of wanted a bigger project. And a friend of mine that was living in Los Angeles sent me this listing in the middle of the night, like 2:00 in the morning. And the headline was something like, buy your own ghost town for under $1 million or something to that effect. And he sent it almost as a joke. He said, hey, this might be up your alley, you know, haha. And I woke up and I read it and I was like, oh man, this is it. I remember just diving into the history, reading everything that I could about the town. I think those flashes of my childhood came rushing back to me, you know, that this is Gunsmoke in real life. I ended up getting rid of all my places in Austin. And in March of 2020, right when the pandemic started happening, I packed up all my stuff and moved out here. I thought I'd come out maybe for a couple weeks. And so here I am 4.5 years later almost, and still here, never left. So this is my home now.
You and Lola.
Yeah, me and Lola.
Yeah, and your cats and your goats.
Yep.
You're a young guy. You're in your 30s, and you decided to buy a ghost town. Where exactly is this ghost town? How far is it from civilization?
I think people think ghost town and they think flat desert, but the town's actually at 8,300 feet. It's up in the mountains. And the mountain range that it's in is the Inyo Mountains, which is about 3.5 hours east-ish of Los Angeles and about 3 hours from Las Vegas as well. I'm right at the edge of Death Valley National Park. So 6 miles from where I'm sitting right now is Death Valley National Park. But again, I'm up in the mountains. If I look forward from where I'm sitting right now, I see all of the Sierra Nevada. So I see Mount Whitney, which is the tallest peak in the lower 48. I see the remnants of Owens Lake. And if I were to turn the other way and look out the back window, I would see all of Death Valley National Park. We're in the high desert, so it's not very well vegetated. It's still kind of very desert feely, but it is high up. So in the winter, we'll get 5-6 feet of snow in the town. But at the same time, we have Joshua trees, you know, which are like a classic desert symbolism. And so it's a very interesting geographical mix up here.
Can people like Michelle and I, if we're brave enough, can we visit? How do we even get there? And what should we be driving? Is it like a dirt bike, a four-wheeler? I don't know.
Yeah. We're open every day, 9 to 5. I love people to come up and visit and check it out. There's no charge. It's free to walk around, look at all the old buildings. But I will say, to your point, the final 8 miles to get here is a dirt road. And this dirt road increases a mile in elevation during that 8 miles. So it's very steep and it's a very dirt, rocky mountain road. And so 4-wheel drive is always recommended. I think that if you're going towards Mammoth Lakes, which is a popular destination from Los Angeles, we're right along 395. That's the main highway that leads to Mammoth Lakes. Eventually it leads to Yosemite as well.
Okay.
So if anybody's in that area, or if you're in Las Vegas and you're coming through Death Valley National Park, we're just on the other side of the Death Valley National Park. And I love for people to come up, check it out, see what we're doing here. I think it's a really interesting snapshot into the American West, and I'd love to show people.
That's amazing. With your following online, have you had any celebrities drop by?
I never planned the place to be a social media hub or anything like that. I think in early pandemic and people were looking for hobbies. Some people started making sourdough bread, and I started making videos because I thought it would be interesting to learn that skill set. So I was capturing those, and the videos started taking off. And so early on, there's a number of people that reached out and I think wanted to come and take a break from the cities. I think it was a good time for people to come. So we've had like Jeff Goldblum come up. We've had Cole Sprouse come up. G-Eazy, who's a musician, Ghostman, a bunch of other musicians that have come and kind of
I love G-Eazy.
either come up to relax or to just get away from things. And I think that and in the YouTube world too, other YouTubers have come up and like done their own spin here, which has been really helpful. You know, I originally created it as this hobby that I thought was very interesting, but nowadays it really contributes to the town moving forward, where if there's a problem that we're trying to tackle. So for instance, we needed a water tank up here, right? And so I can then put in the videos, I can say, hey, we're looking for a water tank. And suddenly there's these guys called the Diesel Brothers out of Utah who have this diesel company where they have these massive trucks, and they were able to bring me up this water tank that's 40 feet long that I could never bring up on my own. And so it's been very nice to see the support from the community that you mentioned that's everywhere out there now.
What are you, like the mayor, the sheriff in town?
I was just thinking that same thing. Are you the mayor of Cerro Gordo?
I feel like I wear a lot of hats. I'm probably the mayor, the sheriff, the outhouse superintendent, you know, whatever is needed for that day.
One thing about ghost towns, especially in the West, there's a lot of similarities when it comes to previously being a gold mining town or a copper mining town. Describe to us what Cerro Gordo was like in its heyday.
Yeah, so the town was established in 1865 as a mining town by a guy named Pablo Flores. And he was a Mexican prospector that came up here and he discovered a surface deposit. It's called the Jefferson Chimney. And then the real boomtown era came when word got out that this high quality silver was being discovered in these hills. A guy named Mortimer Belshaw, whose house I'm sitting in right now, Belshaw came up here and he partnered and he brought real big investment from San Francisco. At that period of time, the population boomed to about 4,000 people up here by about 1868. What I find interesting is when Cerro Gordo's population was 4,000, Los Angeles's population was about 6,500 or 7,000 people.
Oh, wow.
So to put it in perspective, they were almost like equal trading partners.
Oh, wow.
And so there's a bunch of quotes from back in the day from the different newspapers saying like how important the trade of Cerro Gordo was to the development of Los Angeles. And I think that it's interesting to kind of think about.
If you are to visit, what is it like? What will we see? What will we do? Aside from hang out with you, of course.
Yeah. So we have a museum here. The museum has a lot of the history of the town. We have a movie theater here that we kind of screen videos about the town's history. Then you can wander around, see some of the old mining buildings that were used for testing the quality of the minerals, get a sense of what the town was like back in the day. And then kind of my favorite little loop goes up to a little crest where you can see into Death Valley National Parks. And it's just a stunning geography here. The main thing is taking a day tour, just looking around the different buildings. Hopefully this time next year, there's a 6-bedroom hotel with a bar and a restaurant. And so at that point in time, people could come up, get a lunch, get a drink if they'd like, overlook the entire valley, see Owens Valley, see Mount Whitney and all this here in Nevada.
I think one of the things that was very interesting looking at your videos is when you're hiking and you're describing some of the hikes is really hard and really challenging. Just watching you go from like, maybe I'm exaggerating, but maybe like 5,000, 6,000 feet up in elevation. And then there's like sudden drops there.
There is.
I mean, are these some things that we have to be mindful of? Because I haven't seen anything like that where the terrain just changes really quickly.
Yeah, we actually recently just established our first main hiking trail around the town that gives beautiful views, but it is challenging. I would say if people do come and visit, hydration is important. Up above 8,000 feet, people can sometimes get altitude sickness. Sunscreen's important, comfortable walking shoes. But I think that like the rugged nature of it is part of the appeal to me.
One of the things that I've enjoyed is watching videos of you going down into the mines, which I would never do for the record, but I will live vicariously through your videos. What are some of the most interesting things that you have found in the mines at Cerro Gordo?
Yeah. I mean, the whole town exists because of the mines, right? And so underneath the town, there's a main shaft that goes 900 feet straight down. And off of that shaft, there's 30 miles of mines that are snaking everywhere like a honeycomb.
Oh,
And so
wow.
I go down there to try to understand the history above as well. And you do find artifacts from the past. I think that probably some of my favorite finds is I've found a pair of Levi jeans, which I don't know if you're too familiar with the history of Levi's, but Levi's created the first blue jeans as we knew it for California silver miners in the 1870s. And so these old Levi's can be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, in the right condition. The ones that I found were not they're very torn up and terrible, but I just think that like it's interesting to know that like this thing that's so ubiquitous within a culture, like the blue jean was created for these guys and like that were actually here at Cerro Gordo doing that mining, like that those pants. Or like one of my favorite things is I found a note inside of a tobacco tin. And basically the note was just a guy communicating with somebody at a different level about essentially, I think, what time they were trying to take lunch is what I would decipher between it. But I
the
think that
important
like
things in life.
Yeah, like it humanizes it to where it's not just these black and white pictures of people like far in the past that were doing these things. Like the tunnels that I'm walking through were created by people not terribly different than myself, that like were out here for their own dream that they were trying to see come true. And so that idea just like it draws me in deeper into the history here. And all of those things are in the museum right across the street. So if anybody wants to see them, they're all right over there.
Well, you wouldn't find those interesting things if it weren't for the interesting people. We talked about Lola, for example, who is, I'm sorry, I am so freaked out by that. I will probably continue to be freaked out by that. But are there any other interesting people that lived in Cerro Gordo?
Yeah, there was a bunch of people. Mortimer Belshaw, he was the one that kind of brought the big prosperity boom. In the 1910s, this guy named L.D. Gordon came up and he discovered zinc that was here. So they were ignoring all the zinc and only focusing on the silver. And so he brought another 30 years of prosperity here by discovering zinc. So I guess if you look at the house that I'm in and then you look at the Gordon house that he built in 1910, it's a lot fancier. It's 2 stories. It's different architecture. There's also stories of some of the infamous characters from the American West, like Mark Twain, Butch Cassidy, these guys. There's rumors of them rolling through town at different times because when this town was at its peak, they pulled close to $500 million worth of minerals out of here if you adjust it for inflation. So when it was booming, if you were in any part of this region, you would have known about Cerro Gordo. You probably would have gone to go up there, see what it was all about. I find that each character here within Cerro Gordo, whether it was Lola or Mortimer Belshaw, has a story that's like equally rich to some of these ones that have been made popular by movies like Tombstone and other stuff. And so I think that like telling their story is like an interesting thing to do.
The name Mortimer is like, if there is a ghost town name, Mortimer is definitely, it's definitely it.
You prove that ghost towns aren't necessarily abandoned. Do you know of anyone else living in any ghost towns anywhere? Like, have you made friends in either your ghost town or maybe the neighboring ghost town?
The secret society of ghost town owners.
So there's a number of people around California and Nevada that have ghost towns of their own. One of my favorites is just up the road. There's a town that was a gold mining town in the early 1900s called Gold Point. And Gold Point's just into Nevada. And Gold Point was mined until the 1960s. And then in the 1970s, this guy named Walt came out there. And Walt, imagine like, your typical guy from Brooklyn, heavy New York accent that was out there just kind of wanting to learn about the West.
A Brooklyn accent. Wait, this is more than I thought, right? What does Walt look like?
Walt is 70s probably. He's wearing a cowboy hat. He usually open carries, so you usually see his pistol on his belt. Yeah, heavy Brooklyn accent that immediately will just launch into his takes on what's going on in America. But Walt has an amazing bar and even more amazing stories. And so people from all over the desert kind of go out, visit Walt. I think a lot of times in these towns, yes, you're visiting for the history somewhat, but you're also visiting for the characters. And I think that Gold Point is a very character-driven ghost town.
With a cowboy hat and boots and pistol. Don't forget that.
The main reason I go to Gold Point is to visit Walt at his bar. I'm pretty sure doesn't have any permits. And the bar's also only open when Walt feels like the bar should be open. And so don't expect any hours. Don't expect any like hospitality, really.
Really?
It could look like an antique shop. It's just filled with all of the stuff that was accumulated or given to Walt over the years.
I love it. I love
from
it.
taxidermied stuff to posters to shuffleboard table to just all of these things. And it's nice to find somebody else that understands some of the struggles of the remote nature of living in these types of towns and kind of is trying in his own way to bring it back to life. And I like find a deep resonance in that.
Where exactly is Gold Point?
Yeah, it's just over the border between California and Nevada. It's very much in the middle of nowhere. It's
Okay.
very far from everything. And so it's not a place that, is perfect for every visitor, but I think that there's a lot of different offerings amongst different old mining towns. But a very interesting take if you're wanting to take like a ghost town circuit of this area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It seems like most ghost towns only have a few buildings still standing. Are there any bigger ghost towns out there?
Yeah, there's a really big one just north of me called Bodie. And Bodie's a state park that has still hundreds of buildings in it. Used to have 10,000 people there, and it is just massive. A lot of the same characters from Cerro Gordo would make their way over there. Like there's a one-armed lawyer named Ned Reddy that used to defend all of the infamous mine owners. Yeah. And so he was Mortimer Belshaw's lawyer, and he also had a house in Bodie. And so apparently the one-armed lawyer was a very feared person in the courts because he would basically always get his way, and they by any means necessary. And so a lot of the characters from Cerro Gordo would make their way to Bodie. So if you are doing the tour and you go to Cerro Gordo, Ned Reddy had a garage here. Then you can go to Bodie and you can see his home, which is still preserved and laid out. But Bodie as a visit it's very different from Cerro Gordo. It's also high in elevation, but it's very flat. Where Cerro Gordo is kind of on the side of a hill.
Mm-hmm.
Bodie is a huge kind of meadow. It has still many hundreds of buildings, and Bodie is what they termed as arrested decay. So essentially, the mine was active until the 1940s. They were mining for gold, and then eventually in the 1960s, the family that owned it gave it over to the state of California. And the mandate that they kind of put in place was, we're not going to restore this to what it was, but we're also not going to let it turn into dust. We're going to capture this exact moment in time and keep it as this for as long as we can. And so it's basically a snapshot of what the town looked like when the state took it over. And so the buildings are falling over, but they're stabilized. It's leaking, but they're patching the roof. And so it's a very cool snapshot of a period of time because it gives you an idea of what the town would have been when in its heyday. But the buildings would have been new in their heyday, not 150 years old and falling over. And so Bodie's definitely like an amazing place to go. It's very cool to see what a town like that can be preserved with the funding of the state. It's a state park and it's very, very heavily trafficked.
It's definitely on my list of places to go. When I think about a snapshot of what the Old West looked like, I think about Bodie. But the problem with Bodie is that there's a curse apparently for anyone who goes to Bodie and leave with something.
Yeah, it was pretty inventive by a park ranger there. It was something that they created where essentially they created this idea that if you were to take something from Bodie, that you'd essentially be cursed forever. And the thing about it is it worked. And so a lot of times people will have these items from Bodie and they'll say, hey, my life has gone to complete and utter chaos since I've taken this. I'm so sorry. And they'll mail it back in. And it's interesting. I went up there and I took a very long tour with some of the park rangers. And something that they were explaining to me that I find interesting is that, it's kind of a problem now because if, let's say you take something from Bodie, you go home, your life is cursed, and you decide to send it back to Bodie, they can't confirm that that item's actually from Bodie. They're just taking your word. So they can't actually put it back on the property. And so they have this room of all of this stuff. It's kind of created a weird moment for them where they don't really know what to do with the stuff that people are sending them. Because again, in any historical town, anything like context is everything, right? So when you pick up that bottle, if it's not in the same place, the context is removed. The history is kind of like a bit of a question mark. And so it's an interesting curse that I don't mess with anything from Bodie. I won't take
Better not.
I don't even buy souvenirs there. So I don't want anything from there.
Is your fate that bad?
Some people have been bad. I just feel like, there's enough going against me trying to bring an old town back to life. I don't need anything else coming at me. And so I'm just leave it alone.
Ned had something to do with the curse, right? Like,
Yeah.
I feel like, especially if he always got his way, he's probably still getting his way today.
Find that arm, you'll break the curse.
Yeah.
So it sounds like some of the stories behind this curse were really captivating. I read a story that someone took a piano. I mean, I guess it's a ghost town, but
I think before it was fully under the state park rule, it was kind of just like a known thing that existed that the family that owned it was having a hard time. So I think that some things were like either taken to be then sold in antique shops or taken to be auctioned off or things like that. And I imagine that as this curse gets out there, if somebody has been told that this piano that their grandmother bought from a antique store came from Bodie, maybe they start connecting the dots and like, okay, everything that's gone wrong in my life is because of this piano. I don't want it anymore. Take it back, please. And like here at Cerro Gordo, I haven't tried to introduce that curse, but I've had a few things sent back to me that are from Cerro Gordo's past, which I'll happily put into our museum because I like, usually they're like photographs or something that I can understand. And I think that it's
that's cool.
it's another cool thing of just having a kind of people following along with the town is that you get these kind of pieces of the history here that otherwise would have been lost or just never gotten back to here. I'm appreciative of Bodie doing what they could.
When I think of a ghost town, I picture scenes from old Western movies, dirt roads, low wooden buildings, tumbleweed. What's a really old West ghost town that we can visit that would bring this vision to life?
Yeah, I think Calico matches that really well. It's imagine like an old Western movie set with the shootouts in the middle of the day and all of the old Western facades. And there's a lot of history, but it's as close to, I would say, like an amusement park as you could kind of go, where they have the ghost tours, they have their little mini train that they have that takes like an 8-minute trip around the town. You can pan for gold, you can shoot out. A lot of the facades have been built up to appear how the buildings would have been back in the day, but aren't necessarily the buildings from back in the day. I think it's a much more probably like family friendly place to go than maybe some of the other places, because it's like you were to enter a wing of Disneyland that was dedicated to the American West, but instead it like has actual history to it. And so you go and like, I think they even stage like the shootouts at noon kind of thing. And so
very fun.
It's definitely like a place where if you're dipping your toe in, that's probably like an easy entry point into the ghost town world. It's probably the most convenient of any of the places I've just mentioned too. I believe the Knoxbury Farms people own quite a bit of it or of all of it. And so it's kind of been very well established. It's comfortable. They know what they're doing. And then if you want to kind of like dip your toe further, you can head out to like the Bodies, Cerro Gordos, and Gold Points, which all have their own little unique mixes.
And then we meet Walt on that trip.
Yeah.
This sounds like the Disney of ghost towns. Sounds like my kids would absolutely love it with the train ride and the gold mining. What was Calico like before it became a ghost town?
Yeah, it was a very productive mine as well. I think a little bit after Cerro Gordo's era, they were mining silver down there as well. The difficulty is that with mining camps, they were expecting these places to last for maybe 5 to 8 years. That's when the mine would run out. So they weren't building any of the structures for longevity. They were building them to make your money and get out. And so I think the same with Calico, probably used to have a much bigger footprint than it does today. But over the time, the weather, fires, different things have kind of like collapsed some of the buildings and lost them. And so I think that these towns that we do have left from that era are important to preserve to the best of our ability, to give people that sense and to at least have a reason to continue discussing the history that was surrounding them. And so I think that's kind of like why there isn't more of these towns necessarily out there, just because they weren't necessarily built to last.
You mentioned that the family who owns Knott's Berry Farm, and you saw Michelle and our eyes lit up a bit. We both know that place. I remember it as a child. Where is Calico located?
Yeah, it's still pretty remote. And so you still get that sense that, you're definitely at a ghost town, that you're going to get the sense of what maybe some of these mining towns would have been like. And so I think that each of the places that we've discussed all have their unique, take on things, and they all have their unique history. And probably it's not like you see one of them, you've seen them all. They all have a different offering. And that's kind of what I think is like unique about all of them.
How historically accurate then is Calico? Is it based on how the town really was, or is it more based on old Westerns and more having an entertainment aspect compared to some of the other places we've talked about?
I think they're going for the essence of a Western town, not necessarily the like strict historical record of the town. I think that they're probably using that as inspiration to some of their stories, but I don't think it's like an exact replica in a way that, a Bodie is like very precise. This is exactly where the building is. I think that they're, like Calico, they're trying to use the essence of a mining town. And so I think they're definitely more on the entertainment end of it than, the strict historical regulation end of it.
Why do you think it's important that we keep these places alive?
The history of the West can be complicated. This idea of going west to stake your claim is based upon mining, right? So like mining towns were filled with these dreamers that came out here dreaming of a better life. And it didn't happen a lot of the time, probably, to be fully transparent. I found a briefcase one of my very early days here at Cerro Gordo. And there was all of these documents from this guy named Chet Reynolds. He had like divorce settlements and he had love letters and then he had bankruptcy.
Oh, wow.
And so he had everything in between. So you could kind of patch together the idea of this guy that came out here. And all of the letters, if you read them, they're kind of always filled with heartbreak, where it's like interesting for me to like look through that briefcase. And like, I've told the story of Chet Reynolds many times, that I find that like it fascinating what drove him to continue on when like he had the bankruptcy, the divorce settlements, all of these things that he was having happen to him over and over again. They say that the best thing to sell in the gold rush was pickaxes or whatever. I think that most people didn't make a lot of money, but the essence of what the dream that they were chasing is one that I think encapsulates the American spirit in a lot of ways. And so I think that the history of Cerro Gordo informs a lot of the history of California. The history of California informs a lot of the history of America. And I think that like my hope is that many future generations get to come to a Cerro Gordo, experience what it was like here, and then maybe they go on to carry the history forward in their own way.
That's beautiful. I cannot wait to see what unfolds at Cerro Gordo. I will be following on TikTok, on Instagram, on all the places. Brent Underwood, thank you so much for being on the VIA podcast.
Of course. Thank you so much. If you ever want to come out and visit, we're open. Come on out.
We want to meet Lola and Ned. And thank you again so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you guys for having me.
Coming up on the VIA podcast, stories from AAA members. I don't know about you, but when it comes to taking a vacation, I get lots of ideas of where to go and what to see. I just don't know how to plan it all. Like, I know I want to take a transatlantic cruise one day, but then I Google it and it's just overload. That's why I turn to the experts at AAA Travel, where all vacation planning services are included as part of my membership. Members get great rates on their hotel and rental car, AAA's best price guarantee on cruise packages, and even exclusive extras reserved just for members. You can learn more by visiting AAA.com and visiting the AAA Travel section.
Mitty, Brent was a real expert on ghost towns, but I bet AAA members also have some of their own great ghost stories to share.
Great or scary?
Maybe both. We heard from AAA member Elizabeth Morris from Nevada. She writes, I've been to Bodie many times. Its state of, quote, arrested decay offers a look into the world before we knew it. The glass is wavy. The nails are square. You can peer in the windows and see remnants of wallpaper and furniture.
Oh, okay, Bodie. I see you. I see what you're doing there.
It's a state park, Mitty. Get that junior ranger badge and take yourself to Bodie.
I think I'm ready to take on Bodie.
We also heard from AAA member Barbara Novak from Nevada. Barbara writes, 2 of my favorite ghost towns are in Nevada, Candelaria and Rhyolite. I hope I'm saying that right. Mm-hmm. Candelaria is very remote and has abandoned open pit mines nearby. Rhyolite has a house made of bottles, and the original train station is still intact. Nearby, there's also an art installation called the Gold Well Open Air Museum and a small museum shop. Bring your lunch and walk around the towns. Both are easily accessible with 2-wheel drive car. Stop in Tonopah. It has a fabulous mining museum, and stay at the restored Mitspa and Belvedere hotels.
You see, Michelle, this is more of my speed.
I say we go visit Brent in Cerro Gordo, and then we go see Walt. We need to get to Gold Point. I need to meet Walt.
Okay, maybe you can convince me. We'll see.
Love your comments, questions, and especially your stories about travel in the West. Send us an email at viamail@viamagazine.com. Again, that email is viamail@viamagazine.com. The VIA podcast is hosted by Mitty Hicks and Michelle Donati. That's me.
Produced by Whitney Fanoof, editor-in-chief of VIA, Katie Henry, managing editor of VIA, and editorial consultant April Kilcrease, alongside Dave Beasing and Jason Jackson of Sound That Brands.
Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to follow and subscribe to the VIA podcast. That way, you'll never miss an episode. Discover more places to travel in the West at AAA.com/VIA. VIA Magazine is published by AAA Mountain West Group. We'll see you back here for season 2 of the VIA podcast.
The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of AAA Mountain West Group or its personnel.